My name is Kirby Kreider. I work for the CEL project, and I'm going to be facilitating the webinar this morning, introducing our wonderful speakers. We have some excellent speakers lined up on this very timely topic, and we saw a lot of interest in this topic. So we're really delighted to be here with you. I just wanted to give you a few quick notes. Number one is that this webinar is going to be recorded. In fact, it's being recorded already. And it will be shared on land links after the event. So everything that's going on in the chat box, everything you're hearing, everything that you're seeing on the screen is going to be recorded and shared. That chat box is really important in the bottom right-hand corner. Please use that throughout to ask questions, technical questions of our speakers. We're going to have a virtual panel at the end of this session. And also use that chat box to let us know if you're having technical issues, if you can't hear a speaker, if you can't see the slides, and we can do whatever we can to make that work for you. I have a few other colleagues in the room who are on board for tech support and ready to help out. When we sent the registration link, we asked the question, what are you interested in learning more about? And so I just quickly put together a word cloud for us to reflect on some of those things. And a few things popped out. I think women and the gender issue popped out. Formalization was really big. But an overall takeaway from this was that you all were interested in a lot of different sectors and aspects of this issue. So I think that reflects well with the speakers that we have today and some of the things that our first two speakers are going to talk about especially. So very quickly, objectives of this webinar are to launch USAID's new issue brief on ASM, artisanal and small scale mining and development. You can download that issue brief, or actually you can jump to the page where that issue brief is housed on land links using the links and resources tab over on the right side of your screen. There's a couple of other links in there too, including a brand new Medium post that just came out yesterday. We're also going to provide an overview of USAID's global work on ASM, looking at where and how we seek to address the issue, highlight an example of USAID's ASM programming in Colombia, the Oro Legal program, and look at some lessons learned, and talk about some common challenges with ASM programming, not just in Colombia, but across the globe. I think we have a global perspective, and then we'll dive into a country example. And also we want to take advantage of the fact that we have folks from across the U.S. government and across our partners and from the private sector and from NGOs and identify opportunities for collaboration. So those are our objectives, which of course inform our agenda. So we're going to start with Kim Thompson from the USAID Office of Land and Urban. She's going to provide an overview of the ASM issue and an overview of USAID's work on the issue globally. Next, we'll move to Tara DeYoung, who's with Tetra Tech, and he's going to talk about challenges, issues, lessons learned, and some programming recommendations. Then we'll move into a large portion of the webinar where Peter Doyle, who's the Chief of Party for Oro Legal, is going to talk about that Colombia example. Finally, we'll move into a virtual panel discussion. So again, please use that chat box in the bottom right-hand corner as you have questions. We will be cataloging those and sorting them, and if we don't get to them in the webinar, we will answer at least a portion of them afterwards. So please ask your good questions. We really like to see that, and I think that will make the experience better for everyone. So first, I wanted to introduce Kim Thompson. She's with the USAID Office of Land and Urban. She's a career Foreign Service Environment Officer who specializes in the linkages between natural resources and conflict. So I think she's going to bring a broad, multi-sectoral perspective. And she served overseas at USAID missions, in the DRC and in Thailand. So with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Kim. And Kim, if you can just unmute yourself, and I will mute myself so I don't cause any background noise.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kirby. I'm really excited to be with all of you today as we discuss and explore this complex relationship between artisanal and small-scale mining, or ASM, and development. This webinar is really quite timely as we're seeing increasing interest from USAID missions, from the interagency, and from Congress to better understand the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. As Kirby already mentioned, it also coincides with the publication of USAID's first issue brief on artisanal and small-scale mining and development. It also is coinciding with USAID's Democracy is Global campaign, which elevates USAID's efforts to foster stability, uphold the rule of law, shine a light in dark places, and protect the most vulnerable. And perhaps nowhere is this more important and more challenging than in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. So we are extremely lucky. I'm very excited to be sharing this panel with Tara and Peter. They collectively bring decades of experience implementing development programs on the ground in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. But before we hear from them, I wanted to kick off this webinar by just taking a few minutes to frame the discussion, talk about the ASM sector globally, USAID's work in the sector, and highlight a few of the linkages that we'll hear more about today from Tara and Peter. And first off, just to get everyone on the same page definitionally, when we're speaking about artisanal and small-scale mining, we are referring to quite a diverse sector that ranges from, for example, essentially non-mechanized mining that could involve, maybe a small group of miners with some shovels and a few other simple tools, all the way to semi-mechanized operations that, for example, may be using heavy equipment to quickly process massive amounts of sediment from riverbeds to mine for gold, like we are increasingly seeing in the Amazon. So just to note that this sector actually is quite large and quite diverse, however, all artisanal and small-scale mining, or I shouldn't say all, but most of it, it tends to operate, a lot of it is operating in the informal economy and tends to be quite labor-intensive. Since artisanal and small-scale mining does operate largely in the informal economy, the exact numbers are actually quite difficult to estimate, but somewhere around, I think it's safe to say that somewhere around 40 million people are directly working in the sector, and 3 to 5 times that number rely on the sector indirectly for their livelihood. Artisanal and small-scale mining is one of the most important, if not the most important, rural non-farm livelihood in a lot of developing countries. It can be particularly important for people living in some of the poorest and most isolated parts of the developing world. So it is really a sector that we should be paying attention to as development professionals and figuring out how to mitigate some of the social and environmental risks that occur along with the sector and help formalize it and help bring the sector into the more formal economy and make sure it's contributing to development. So despite being a largely invisible sector, it actually accounts for quite a large percentage of the global supply of minerals. So ASM accounts for somewhere around, again, these numbers are just estimates, but it accounts for somewhere around 80% of the global production of sapphires and colored gemstones, and somewhere around 20 to 25% of the global production of a lot of other minerals such as gold, diamonds, tin, tantalum, etc. What you can see here is a map of USAID's recent investments in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. So these are our investments in the last 5 years. USAID missions around the world have developed programs that, with a total estimated value of around 140 million, to address artisanal and small-scale mining in the countries that are highlighted there. There are several programs in Colombia over the last 5 years in Colombia and Peru, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. And I thought I would note that it seems to be that USAID's investments seem to be increasing. About 50 million of that, or about 1/3, seems to have happened just in the last year. So artisanal and small-scale mining has quite a complex relationship with development. And in many countries, the mining sector actually undermines development due to a number of factors, including perhaps the capture of the mining sector by disreputable or powerful groups. And then, as a result, they're receiving the most of the economic benefits, while many more people are suffering from the negative environmental, social, and economic consequences of the sector. And so as we think about the journey to self-reliance and how the artisanal and small-scale mining sector contributes to that, it really impacts a huge number of more sort of traditional development sectors, such as economic growth, women's empowerment, governance, the environment, human rights, crime, etc. So we do have an issue brief that covers all of these topics. We do not have time today to discuss all of them in depth. I will point out a few of them that were noted in that pre-webinar survey that there was particular interest in. So for instance, in terms of the environment, we believe that at least 10 million artisanal and small-scale miners in more than 70 countries are using mercury, which is a dangerous neurotoxin to mine for gold. And this is making the artisanal and small-scale gold mining sector the largest source of mercury pollution in the world. It is also the leading cause of deforestation now in many protected areas around the world. So for environmental reasons, it is quite an important sector to be paying attention to. In terms of crime and corruption, again, the numbers are quite difficult to estimate, but it has been estimated that illegal mining is estimated to be worth somewhere between $12 and $48 billion annually. In 2016, the value of illegal gold production in South America was estimated to be at least $7 billion. So the sector that is the informal sector and some of the linkages to transnational criminal organizations are estimated to be quite valuable and quite likely more valuable than human trafficking or wildlife trafficking. There are also significant gender components. Women comprise up to 50% of the ASM workforce, but often face additional obstacles and have little awareness of their rights. I just want to note that we're currently working on an issue brief that addresses ASM and gender, and that will be out soon. So when we look at successful artisanal and small-scale mining programs that USAID has developed, the thing they have in common is complexity. That they tend to address a broad range of development challenges. They are directly engaging on issues of corruption, organized crime. They're collaborating with numerous partners. And luckily, we have both Tara and Peter with us today that have been doing that for a long time and can really talk about how they've successfully managed to program in this complex sector. So thank you very much for your time. I'm really looking forward to a rich discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kim. I think you really highlighted the scale of the issue and the ways that it touches a lot of different sectors, and I think that's helpful to start us out. I would like to just make another plug for you all to, if you have questions for Kim, for Tara, for Peter, please just enter those in the chat, and again, we will be capturing those and logging them. And we'll introduce those in the virtual panel at the end of this. I'd like to next introduce Tara de Jong, who's a technical advisor on the USAID Artisanal Mining and Property Rights, or AMPR project. He's an expert in artisanal and small-scale mining, conflict minerals, land tenure policy and reform, and he's worked on ASM programs in Cote d'Ivoire and Central African Republic. So with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Tara.
Thanks, Kirby, and hello, everyone. Greetings from Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. Very happy to be with you here this morning. I've worked for the last 8 years in artisanal small-scale mining communities and countries in West and Central Africa. And what I wanted to do this morning to kind of kick off this discussion is to look at 5 big issues or conundrums that we often face in implementing these USAID programs, with some ideas and reflections on trends and how best to address them. First big issue is formalization, and this is something that is in many respects the objective of a lot of our programs, but we often don't step back and think about what do we actually mean by formalization. And one thing that I've found is that there is sometimes a confusion or a conflation between formalization and legalization. You know, a lot of our programs, we are working towards trying to increase legality, register miners, register traders, develop chains of custody that are legal and follow national legislation. But by overly focusing on legalization, we sometimes can miss some of the big picture. And part of that has to do with the fact that often legal frameworks are ill-adapted to the realities of artisanal mining. Sometimes mining codes will treat artisanal mining as miniature versions of large-scale mines, whereas in reality, they're quite different in terms of how they're organized spatially, in terms of the supply chain, their needs, and a lot of these legal frameworks are challenging to implement. There's also a fair amount of stigmas and biases, often in policymakers in the countries where we work, against artisanal and small-scale miners. And this can be due to a variety of factors, such as national priorities that tend to focus on foreign direct investment, on projecting a positive image, industrialization. And that can often create kind of blind spots where, by overly focusing on narrow legalization, policymakers can overlook the real economic potential of the small-scale sector as well. And at the end of the day, legal mining can be negative. There can be legal mining that's terrible for the environment if the framework is badly conceived. And from certain perspectives, illegal mining can be positive. If there's a big boom site in a particular village, that can result in dealing with issues of mass unemployment, and from sort of community perspective, sometimes, often in West African context, people prefer that the youth are involved in mining than, say, running off and doing other activities. So when we try to think about formalization, we try to think of it not as kind of an end state of everyone having the right paperwork, but rather as a process, process that's collaborative, process that is participatory, and is especially multi-stakeholder. So it involves governments at local and national level, but also supply chain actors at different levels as well, from miners to exporters, and of course, communities in their diversity as well. The process is about rule setting and rule enforcement. These can be laws, norms, standards, customary institutions, all with the shared objective of making ASM contribute to sustainable development, however that is defined by those actors in their particular context. How do we take something from abstract and put it in practice? What we've found is that Often creating spaces for dialogue, information sharing is key. And as outside partners, we have kind of a convening power that we can do that. These can range from sectoral meetings at a very local level to national dialogue with respect to ASM policy. And a big part of the goal is also to empower actors so that they really can participate. Because often miners are operating in an environment where there are power asymmetries, and by helping and focusing on also having them develop their voice and having others recognize their rights in the overall framework can also be a key approach. And finally, involving awareness raising and education is also a key approach, not just towards miners, but also towards governments, getting government agents out of the capital into the field to really understand and to think outside the box about the problems. Those are all strategies that can contribute to a broader goal of formalization that goes just beyond having the right license. Another conundrum or issue that we often are faced with is that governments alone cannot manage or control most ASM. Part of it is just practical. ASM occurs over thousands of square kilometers in many cases, or tens of thousands of miners. And if we're talking about, governance of ASM, we have to be going beyond just governments as well. But it's also not just practical, but also related to the need for checks and balances. There are real risks in a lot of the countries where we operate, where government agents can commit abuses. They have their own priorities and structures. And so there really is a need to also balance interests. And that gets back to that formalization as a multi-stakeholder process. But in terms of solutions, we like to think of it in terms of co-management. And this can be between large-scale mining companies and small-scale miners in some cases. It can be between upstream actors, meaning the producers, and the downstream actors, meaning the traders and the exporters and even the consumers. And it can also be between the customary actors, so the traditional leaders and landowners, and the government. And this last part is particularly important because we find in our programming that focuses a lot on property rights, is that communities for hundreds of years and thousands of years in the case of, not thousands, but at least 1,000 in the case of gold in West Africa, have been managing ASM in their communities and have developed very complex but effective ways of managing what is happening in their areas. Anyone who's been to ASM sites know that they're not necessarily disorganized, but they're highly organized in many ways. And so what we've tried to do is build upon those existing customary practices and convince the government and convince other stakeholders to formalize those practices in co-management frameworks or co-management agreements. I think a good example of that is from Côte d'Ivoire. You can see that in the picture. Here you have a village committee in a diamond mining community that has organized themselves as a village-based cooperative. They've signed a formal agreement with the government through its parastatal mining company. And as a part of that agreement, they monitor what is happening in the mine sites. When they see a new site coming on board, they ask the government for permission to delimit that site. They send their customary guards to watch the washing, and they organize public sales sessions once a week or more, depending on production, at which the diamonds come out, there's a negotiation that takes place, and 20% is taken at the source. 8% goes to the government, and 12% goes to the communities in funds that they manage entirely themselves. And they've generated over $1 million in funds in the last decade that they've invested in infrastructure and other projects that they use. So you see in that example, you have this co-management framework where you're building on these customary practices, especially the land practices in terms of the collective rights that the communities exercise over the land, but also formalizing them and giving it more weight with the state agreeing to collaborate with the communities so that legality is also linked to these customary systems. So the other key issue that we've come across and dealt with is the connections between ASM and the broader economy. ASM does not occur in a vacuum, and sometimes if we focus just on miners or just on production, we lose many key components and leads to a less effective response. Part of that is just the fact that ASM is part of a highly organized and complex supply chain, as mentioned. As the mineral moves through the supply chain, there's financing also that's vital for the sector that moves from the exporters to national traders all the way down to the producers. And if you don't engage that entire supply chain, both as stakeholders, but also in your responses, it can be very difficult to make lasting change because of that complexity. Part of it is just managing spoilers, so key traders who can block interventions, but also looking for key opportunities. ASM is also, an integral part of the rural economy, as Kim mentioned in her remarks. There's a lot of linkages to agriculture in particular in terms of seasonal dynamics, but also agriculture can be used to pre-finance mining and vice versa. Mining revenue is also used as a key investment in local agriculture. And understanding the broader rural economy is absolutely essential. This is especially true in the case of women. Women play key roles in mining, and it's very important to recognize those roles, empower women who are miners or supporters or financiers or others. But even in supply chains where women don't play as strong of a role, such in diamonds is often the case, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't engage women. On the contrary, it's vital to engage women within the broader rural economy. And in our programs, we've worked with thousands of women in agricultural programs, and they have rehabilitated old mine sites, developed agriculture, and they are also key catalysts of change in their communities in terms of decision making and how they influence the ways in which mining is managed. And that brings us to the environmental management. And with respect to environmental management, linking it to the broader livelihoods is absolutely essential. We've found that post-mining reclamation through agriculture has worked quite well. In CAR, we have over 1,000 mining pits that were converted to fish ponds between 2010 and 2012. All of them are still functioning despite the crisis that they went through and play a key role in local economies. Thanks in part to a lot of the work we've done with the communities, clarifying the land rights so that miners feel that they can invest in their land after mining, and also linking environmental management to these co-management agreements and working on land use planning and on the rules in terms of where mining can occur, how mining can occur at the local level with government support is a real key part as well. Fourth has to do with mechanization. And in many ways, the classic definition of ASM as being non-mechanized is increasingly outdated. It doesn't mean that there aren't still millions of people who don't have access to mechanization. But there is a trend, especially in West and Central Africa, where there is an increasing amount of mechanization that is occurring. Part of it is due to in the case of gold, the influx of cheaper Chinese technology, such as what's called the Changfa digger in Ghana, and that is spread elsewhere to Central Africa and West Africa. And there also is a phenomenon where deposits are getting deeper, especially in diamond mining areas, but in gold as well, which necessitates increasing mechanization for overburden removal and for treatment of the ore. This trend, is a double-edged sword in many respects. On the one hand, mechanization can increase productivity, it can increase output for the country, but it also is in many ways accelerating some of the negative environmental impacts. And it also can create new conflicts where more mechanized actors are coming into conflict with communities and also coming into conflict with artisanal miners who don't necessarily have access to this foreign equipment. So what we find what's really important in mechanization is looking at increasing access to appropriate technology. Part of that, and what we've done, is focused a lot on prospection and proper planning of mining operations through hand augers, through terracing techniques, so that if there is mechanization, it isn't all over the place, but it can be confined to certain areas, and the actual extraction can also involve backfilling at the same time. It's key also for regulatory frameworks to adapt to this increasing reality so that there isn't a dual system where artisanal miners are confined to pickaxes and shovels and others, foreign actors, get access to equipment. There needs to be flexible arrangements and ways to facilitate access to technology. There also is a need to improve the technology, and we've done some investment in technology transfer and developing and working with local suppliers as well, so that the technology that is there is working well and working. And this is particularly important, I think, in the case of gold, where you also have technology as a key component of looking for alternatives for mercury. Finally, the issue of politics and crime is something that often comes up and is associated with ASM. ASM is particularly vulnerable to that, to capture by criminal consortia, which describes this intersection between political elites, business, and criminals. There are a lot of power asymmetries in ASM countries. There are a lot of vested interests. There's a lot of corruption. All this makes reform extremely challenging for outside actors in particular. One thing that we found is helpful is, first of all, taking a stakeholder mapping approach to really understand who are the champions in the government, in the supply chains, elsewhere, who are the spoilers, the people behind the scenes, who can block you, who can get you kicked out of the country, and use other tools. Understanding them, and then working insofar as we can as development partners in working with the champions and trying to avoid the spoilers. How? Part of it is through advocacy, supporting civil society, supporting minor organizations who can defend their rights, supporting the news media to build public awareness and engagement. Coordination with law enforcement is key, both at a local level and international level, so that there is information flowing and you look for opportunities. Coordination between donors is key as well, so you can maximize impact and leverage funds. And we've worked closely with the EU, with GIZ and others as well, and that's really fundamental for success. And finally, informal working groups with diplomats is really key. In Côte d'Ivoire, around the time we were working to get the embargo lifted, I would brief a group of 5 to 8 ambassadors once every 3 months, and that they would appreciate a lot of the information that would come from the projects, and they could also be really effective vehicles of political messages that need to take place. And so we really try to work closely with the State Department and foster these types of political technical coordination. So with that, those are some broad level reflections and lessons, and I think that the next presentation also will go into more depth and making these concrete in the particular case of Oro Legal in Colombia. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tara. And I agree with what you just said. I think that's going to help dive us into the next portion of our webinar, which is going to focus on the Oro Legal experience. So again, please, if you have any questions, and I imagine there will be some during this presentation as we get to the more concrete example, but please enter those into the chat box. We'd love to have a few questions to ask our virtual panel that come from the audience. So Peter is the Chief of Party for Oro Legal. He has more than 30 years of experience in environmental management, alternative development, and social and community development. And as the Chief of Party for USAID's Legal Gold activity, Oro Legal, he leads efforts to reduce the negative economic, environmental, and public security impacts of unauthorized, artisanal, and small-scale gold mining operations in 20 municipalities within Colombia. So with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Peter. And if you can unmute.
Hello, everybody. I've just scanned actually the names and organisations of the people listening
to this webinar at the moment, and it's a little bit humbling to be here, actually, given the hundreds, if not thousands, of years of mining experience probably that's represented in the group. I always feel it's important, actually, at this kind of at this juncture in a presentation like this, actually, to confess that I'm not a 30-year mining person. And typically when we do these kind of things and we go around the room and people say worked in artisanal gold mining for 30 years, for 25 years, for 15, for 18 years, and my typical response is, I've worked in it for about 6 years, and I'm still struggling to understand a lot of what happens. But maybe that in itself is useful as we struggle to deal with some pretty challenging issues. And both Kim and Tara flagged some of those big ones. Now, just before I jump into the presentation, and I know that there's a number of people on the list, including some old friends and colleagues that understand Colombia well. But for those that don't, Colombia is interesting in the sense that when Colombia gold mining is mentioned, there's typically an image of large foreign private sector mining companies operating in the country, somewhat divorced from local realities. No, that's a little bit of a myth in the sense that there is virtually no large mining company producing gold in Colombia at the moment. There's a handful of medium-sized ones. That's likely to change in the next couple of years with production coming online. As some of you have probably seen, there was a big purchase recently of a Canadian operation here by a Chinese mining company. Some of the other projects are likely to come on stream quite soon. But there's almost a kind of a hidden reality for people that aren't in the know, that probably anywhere between 75% and 85% of the sector is made up of small operators now. And that in itself, as we've seen with the previous two presentations, on the one hand, creates an enormous problem for the sector. I think any sector, whether it's mining or anything else, that has 80% of its stakeholders, one, located throughout the length and the breadth of the country in some pretty inaccessible places, and two, not part of any formal structure. The flip side of that, as we've seen, is that that could represent as well an enormous opportunity for coherent formal development in a country which is trying to move ahead very seriously with implementing an important peace process and developing genuine sources of regional economic development. So that's the kind of context in which we find ourselves. And obviously, as people who know Colombia as well, the less fortunate side of what's quite a stimulating and beautiful country is this plethora of illegal organizations that operate particularly in a lot of the areas where we find mining. So within that context, what does the legal gold, the Oro Legal activity look to do? It basically looks to do three things, really. We try and legalize and formalize miners, not everywhere, basically where it's feasible to do so, and I'll touch on that feasibility issue in a little while because that's a challenging one. As well as that, we actually try and implement a couple of kind of models to mitigate some very, very severe and wide-scale landscape impact of previous illegal mining, particularly alluvial stuff. And also we try and touch on this issue, which is frequently forgotten, I think, that an awful lot of the people that participate in ASGN, they're not the people that are driving around in top-of-the-range Land Cruisers. No, these are the people at the lower echelons of the value chain that struggle to make a living in gold or anything else. And actually maybe the best alternative for them, not is to improve their conditions within the gold production chain, is really to think of alternatives that can get them out and doing something a little bit more dignified. And that's a third component of our project. So moving on,
And Tara touched on a couple of these things. And what I'd like to do is just drag it down in very, very practical sense. What's the formalization and challenge in Colombia at the moment? We generally like to think of development projects, particularly USAID development projects, as being very inclusive projects. From a social development perspective, we try and include as many people as we possibly can. ASGM formalization is actually the reverse of that. And there's lots of good reasons effectively why we start with a very, very broad church of possible participants. And over time, that's stripped down very, very significant for reasons such as mining in a protected area. So as much as you'd like to be formal, you legally can't, so you have to move out. Mining inappropriately near water sources, you can't do that either. Being attached to a criminal operation that's either running a mine or in an area that's got a significantly profitable extortion activity, then you're out as well. So effectively, what we've found is that over the last 4 years, we've probably had contact with about 650 potential formalization options from mining production units. Of those, and assuming we're successful over the next 15 months, the group then that will become legal and formal is about 135 now. And that 135 is going to happen if we're tremendously successful. So if we hit that 20% figure, we think of it as successful. I guess it's open to debate now. Is 20% kind of good, bad, indifferent? It's a real challenge, and so part of it, I think, has been adjusting mindsets in terms of saying, how do we define success and what's the number attached to that towards the end, I'll talk about why that number might be pretty big in certain aspects, but it's an interesting challenge for all of us that work in the sector now. Tara touched on an important point, but I think it's worthwhile returning to, is legality and formality are kind of two different things, and particularly given the policy context in Colombia. Being legal is a de facto state. Legality is defined as having a legal mining title issued by the government. In the absence of that, having a proxy mining title that can be a civil legal document between a title holder and somebody else given permission to mine on that title. And then having two additional things. A mining works and operations plan, which is approved by the relevant authority, and an environmental instrument, which is approved by the relevant authority. Just getting to that point is enormously challenging and significantly costly for most miners. We have the ability to do that somewhat on the cheap. And the cheap version of becoming legal for most of our mines probably has a price tag of about $50,000. And that's including mines that probably have a mining footprint about the size of the office that I'm speaking from at the moment, and I guarantee you my office is pretty small, right? So that's a big issue. And the final thing that I think it's been interesting to learn is behavior change is really immersed in local culture, and a lot of the local culture that defines ASGM in Colombia is highly illicit. So how do we move mines out of a culture that continually bombards miners with illicit messages and illicit opportunities? That's been a real challenge as well. What USAID has asked me to do in the presentation, and I think it's kind of interesting, and we'll move into this now actually, is to illustrate some of these main points by short videos that we put together. I think that kind of has two advantages really for the listeners. The first one being that you don't really have to listen to me too much, which is probably kind of beneficial over a 15 to 20 minute presentation. But secondly, I think it gives a real feel for what's happening now. And there's a lot of intangibles of this, but as you look at those videos, what I'd ask you to do is to kind of, use maybe the right side of your brain more than the left, and ask yourself, do those images, do the words that people use, do the way they express themselves, does that transmit what we would broadly think about as being formal, reasonable, responsible, legitimate because that's fundamentally what we're trying to do in formalization now. So this is the first small video that we'll go into now.
Yo empecé de la edad de 15 o 16 años a ejercer la minería porque mi papá y mis abuelos desde mucho tiempo atrás venían ejerciendo la minería. Una vez me cayó una niña y me pregunta que si yo tenía papeles para trabajar. Yo sí, claro, yo tengo mi cédula, todo. No, es que usted tiene que tener unos permisos adicionales para trabajar. Cuando pensaron que quitarme los motores, yo comencé a gestionar. Oro Legal ha sido pues el motor para esta empresita que nosotros tenemos. Cuando ellos llegaron acá, ellos comenzaron a enseñar a nosotros qué se tenía que hacer para poder trabajar legal. Yo me siento muy feliz porque tengo trabajadores que tienen su seguro. Dicen pues que la minería contamina mucho, pero es a según como uno haga el trabajo. Supongamos el cauce del río, nosotros lo dejamos tal y como ha estado siempre el río. Antes organizamos las orillas, le sembramos arbolitos. Era muy bueno que todo el mundo se legalizara y que trabajaran todos tranquilos, así como lo estamos haciendo nosotros en estos momentos.
Great. So that's just a snippet of one legal operation that we're working with. I don't want to give the impression that everything is like that, and clearly we're not daft enough to put the videos up of all the things that haven't worked quite so well. But generally, that mine in particular, when we started working with them, was a two-person operation operating with a little shack on the side of the river. And curiously enough, as you've probably seen, the mine owner unfortunately lost an arm in quite a bad accident near to the mine about 18 months ago. The only reason he was actually able then to receive the sophisticated medical help that he needed to deal with that and move on was that he actually had medical insurance as a result of becoming a formal miner. So that was interesting. Let's move on to rehabilitation of degraded landscapes now. It's always a big challenge. The challenge for us partly was how to do it, and particularly cost. We looked at several models which ranged from basically about $4,500 per hectare rehabilitated right through to a top of the range, I think it was called complete ecosystemic recovery model, that was coming in about $16,000 per hectare. The challenge, of course, is that no one's going to pay that to rehabilitate land, so we had to come up with effectively a bargain basement approach, which we brought in at about just under $2,500 per hectare, utilizing pretty well the only tree species in that we could find, which is Acacia mancium, that actually dealt with those conditions. Part of the deal is basically stick in some investment at the start, keep it reasonable, and in tropical climates, providing you can keep people and mining activities and some other stuff away from that area, Mother Nature's still a pretty good bet in terms of actually bringing back vegetation, which then promotes some broader biodiversity development. So that's interesting. And obviously the final lesson, which I guess is something that Kim mentioned at the start, if you can involve more people that have some stake in this being successful, than having less people involved in that, generally speaking, there's a far larger chance that people are not going to then remine on that area, which is ultimately the objective, and they may make some small economic return from doing something which is a little bit more sustainable. No? Just a very quick video, just in 45 seconds, to show what that looks like on one site. So yeah, very briefly, definitely green looks better than that light yellow color on those areas. And we finished up about 16,000 hectares land rehabilitated over the last couple of years, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next period of time. Economic alternatives, now as we've touched on, probably for a lot of people, particularly in Colombia, single women heads of household that find themselves being responsible for a whole set of livelihood and family survival issues in some pretty tough places. Our position has largely been that rather than helping them to become somehow more effective miners, it might actually be better to put them in some different value chains and allow them to do some work in a little bit more dignified way. What does that mean? Effectively, it means you have to generate real cash because you're competing with the returns from the lower echelons of mining. We set a little bit of a goal that the alternatives would basically generate between 1 and 1.5 legal minimum salaries in Colombia, which is about $280 a month. $350 a month probably doesn't sound that much, but it's significant in these communities. And as I said before, there's a particular focus on bringing in women and young people to these activities. The next video I'm going to show actually looks at honey production. And the big thing about that is that the difficulty in one of the areas we're working here is that land distribution is terribly unequal. And so it's hard to think of typically ag-related activities that could substitute for mining simply because people don't have land. The advantages of bees is that clearly they take advantage of other people's trees and vegetation on other areas, and you don't actually have to get into that very, very complex social and legal issue of land tenancy.
En cargueros, en la comunidad, la mayoría sobrevive de la minería. La necesidad que tenía la comunidad de cambiar de pronto de estilo de vida, por decirlo así, ha sido grande. La minería ha causado un daño ambiental por la tala de bosque, por el uso de mercurio también se ha habido afectada la salud. Cuando el proyecto de Oro Legal llegó acá, ya nosotros como asociación habíamos ejecutado otros proyectos, pero fueron unos proyectos que quedaron allí. Cuando llega el proyecto acá fue diferente porque las personas están capacitadas, administrativamente hemos aprendido. Nosotros queremos llevarla a los centros comerciales, a los negocios de cadena, tener un certificado. Tuvimos la oportunidad de vincular a unos jóvenes que se han dado cuenta de que es mejor esto que de pronto la minería. Hemos aprendido a cuidar el medio ambiente. Antes no le damos importancia, pero ya ahora sí.
So again, just a little quick illustration. The people you saw in that video, actually, they're part of a group that over the last 18 months have sold about 90 tons of honey in the area, generating about $250,000. So it's an interesting alternative particularly for women gold panners that operate in pretty tough conditions. No, big issue, women in mining. We generally the project. Probably 30% of our overall beneficiaries are women, particularly in economic alternatives. Women in mining is significantly smaller. I think as Tara mentioned, probably it maybe hits 2%, but it's an increasingly important cohort. And we find that women are open, very well organized, and are really interested in a longer term vision for mining. Kim asked me yesterday when we were preparing this why I thought that was the case, and I gave a pretty poor answer, I think, largely because I don't really know. I have some ideas, but probably, the experience in the group is probably better than mine. But just let's have a quick look at this final video, and you can make up your own minds.
Ser una mujer minera ha sido duro porque uno tiene que enfrentarse, por decir, al sol, al pantano, al barro. Muchos me han admirado por ese trabajo. Nosotros no nos podemos dejar vencer ni decir que porque somos mujeres ese trabajo no lo podemos hacer.
La minería ilegal sí ha dejado la tierra muy maluca en el sentido de que no la recuperan, no le siembran, entonces no quedan sino los huecos.
Empecé a seguir los pasos de una legalización. Pues para mí la minería legal, yo creo que fue como haberme ganado la lotería, porque ya yo no tengo que estar huyendo de nadie, yo ya trabajo tranquila.
Al sembrar, pues obviamente vamos a ver de que la tierra fue trabajada y mitigar los daños que se hacen.
Pues mi sueño es de yo llegar algún día con la minería, cuando ya yo esté por allá viejita, sentarme a vivir, yo no tenga que trabajar más y dejarle toda esta herramienta bien buena a mis hijos, a mis nietos, a mis trabajadores.
And so just to finalize, actually, these are, I guess, for given the experience of the audience for this, these are probably not particularly revolutionary conclusions, but I think they are important to touch on. I think there's a position within the project and certainly within the AID mission in Colombia that ASGM shouldn't actually be for everybody. No, it's a sector that needs well-done mining, and the risks of not doing that properly are significant. So there should be checks and there should be limits on that. But at the same time, for those that are interested and that can do coherent ASGM, there's definitely a feeling that it should be an awful lot easier to become legal and formal. The second point relates, I think, and it's not different to some other places, but definitely public policy should be founded on a genuine differentiation between larger and smaller miners, as it is in pretty well every other sector of the economy. The challenge for smaller miners to become legal in the first instance is enormous, and this generates a whole set of perverse incentives, particularly in places where the state finds it very, very hard to reach just to continue with illegal practices. Again, an unsurprising conclusion, but a particularly important one, is that it's very, very difficult for small miners to become formal in the longer term without some committed private sector partners to provide know-how, to provide experience, and particularly in the areas where we work in Colombia, to provide a illicit reference point that allows them to resist significant illicit pressures. And curiously enough, what we found over the last couple of years, the point at which mines are most vulnerable to illicit penetration is precisely at the point that they become legal. No? So this work that we all do throws up ironies, and there's another ironic conclusion for you. The final thing, I guess, and I applaud AID for continuing to actually to show interest in this sector, despite the challenges that we all know exist, the payoffs to formalization, if they're well done and well implemented, are very, very significant. In our particular case, I don't know, I guess the investment to date has been about $18 million. That's generated $125 million in terms of gold that's moved into the illicit value chain, probably an additional maybe $10 million in terms of royalties, social security, tax payments, which support illicit development. 45 tons of mercury eliminated, which is always a good thing, and so on and so forth. No, so I applaud AID generally for being prepared to get their hands dirty on a challenging issue. And I guess our feeling is that despite those challenges, it's too important to ignore, both in terms of positive and potentially negative impacts. Thanks a lot for the space to chat to you a little while today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. That was really great, and appreciated seeing the visual examples and hearing from some of the folks that you all are working with. I think it really helps to bring this down to a practical level. What I'd like to do now is move us quickly into our virtual panel discussion. We've had a lot of action in the chat box with a number of questions from you all, so I want to respect that time. But first, before we get into your questions, I just wanted to quickly ask Kim and Tara to reflect on the presentation you just saw and name any common themes that you see in your work in other countries outside of just Colombia. Kim, Tara?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that presentation, Peter. I just wanted to reiterate your concluding remark, which is that it's a difficult sector. It's quite difficult and complex, but also I think we really cannot afford to ignore the sector because it does impact development so directly in so many different development sectors that we work in. It's a difficult sector, but it's also one that I really don't think that we should shy away from. I think ignoring it is short-sighted. And I wanted to make a linkage to some of the things that USAID has done in Democratic Republic of Congo that illustrates the payoff of really focusing on the artisanal small-scale mining sector. A number of donors, USAID included, really put a lot of attention to DRC and the artisanal mining sector there and conflict. And in 2010, the UN group of experts reported that almost every mine site in eastern DRC was under the control of armed groups. After a significant amount of investment from a number of donors, including USAID, by 2017, best estimate was that 3 out of 4 of the tin, tantalum, and tungsten sites were free of armed groups. So that's a huge difference, and it goes beyond just whether or not ASM is linked to conflict. It also is part of this formalization process, also helps artisanal and small-scale mining actually contribute to the development of the country. It's far from perfect. It's far from the end state that we would like to see it at, but it is a real step in the right direction. Again, it's just another illustration of the payoff of investing. Thank you.
Excellent. So keeping track of time here, I want to just go ahead and move us into some of the wonderful questions that we received from participants. And start out, I think, one with from Marcelo Viega, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, for Tara, which was how do we formalize ASM if there are no free mineral titles?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. Every country is different, and their national laws are different, and so on. But I think that the broader question, as I understand it, is how do you make licensing as accessible as possible, ranging from free to low cost, to ease of procedure, to how accessible it is. And so I think those are key questions. In the Côte d'Ivoire example I gave, one of the things that I really like about their model is that, in a sense, the licensing is indirect and it's free. The parastatal representing the government basically zones out a broad area where diamond mining can occur, and then they sign these agreements with these villages, and then within the framework of that agreement, government agents can then just delimit with the villages specific areas that are allowed for mining. So there's not a separate title or permitting process because in Côte d'Ivoire, like in many countries, you have to go all the way to the national capital. It takes a long time, can take a whole year. It's not accessible, and so on. So that was like an indirect way where they make mining quite accessible. I think it's important to kind of differentiate in licensing questions between artisanal mining that has the characteristic of being like a large site with multiple actors with various forms of local community management over that area, and artisanal mining where there are really clear individual claims that people stake out and so on. For the latter, the process would be somewhat different than these larger collective sites. And in those cases, having individual licenses is quite important. Whereas in some of these larger sites where you have multiple actors, rush areas, and so on, asking everyone to get individual titles is not realistic. So over the years, we've done a lot of work with helping the governments, map out revenue streams over mining and see, are we successfully lobby the government to reduce the fee of its per miner professional license based on some studies and some modeling. In Côte d'Ivoire, we found that reducing the individual worker cards to zero was not actually as beneficial as we thought, because communities and governments and even the miners themselves like to be able to pay something to show that they were working legally and asserting their rights because they paid something. So every context is different, the legislations are different, but the overall objective or takeaway, I think, is making a licensing system that takes into account the variety of actors, is not just a bonsai miniature version of industrial mines imposed on something that's different, and makes it as accessible as possible if the objective is to bring the maximum number of people into the fold.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you for that answer. I actually have another question for you as well, but other panelists are welcome to answer this. So this is relating to the issue of lack of access to investment, and the idea that let's see, and a question I think around pre-financing and financing in the ASM sector. So is that an issue? How is that an issue? How can we address it?
Yeah, so Armel's question was quite important, talking both about geology and talking about access to finance. There's access to finance is a key issue, and again, in some contexts, it makes sense to engage private sector and look for formal financing options. In general, there have to be certain criteria for that to be viable. The producers have to have a certain track record. They have to be at a certain scale. There needs to be strategies to de-risk, and honestly, there are not many examples that I know of, especially in West and Central Africa, where banks or financiers would want to go anywhere near artisanal and small-scale mining, and it's a big challenge. Of course, that doesn't mean that financing doesn't exist. Informal financing, understanding it, is absolutely key. The bulk of financing will come from traders, exporters, refineries in some cases, and that trickles down in pre-purchasing agreements, and it goes, and that is a key movement of capital. So if you are trying to formalize financing, figuring out how to co-opt some of the traders or people who are already financing and working with them is a key part. And then even at a community level, looking at financing as well. Women in particular, in a lot of communities where we work, even if they're not digging in the pit, they are often investors and managing funds and others as well. And working with them, organizing them, and in associations. We've done a lot of work with providing equipment, which is a key component of financing. So equipment rental pools to help de-risk and provide indirectly forms of financing. Those are all strategies that can work. On the geology point is also really key. I think there is, though, a temptation to think about geology, well, we should just map out all the mining areas and then give what is good for artisanal miners to artisanal miners, and whatever's industrial is industrial. It's often not practical or realistic to think of it in that kind of linear fashion because of the costs with respect to basic geological research, the inequalities that exist, and also just the reality that artisanal miners are the prospectors and the geologists in many cases identifying new industrial deposits. So what's key in with respect to geology is helping artisanal miners and others better understand how their field experience relates to formal geology, and we've done work with the U.S. Geological Survey and with others, with hand augers to help improve the knowledge for them. But it also is a question of looking at how do you secure rights for artisanal miners if they do discover things, and often legislations can be problematic in that regard. And finally, of course, building trust. We have there's a good case from the 1980s in CAR where someone came in and built a really good geological map of where the diamond deposits were, and coded everything green for really good, red there wasn't much deposits, and so presented it to the miners, and all the miners immediately went to the red spots because they were sure that the outsiders were lying on the map about where the good spots were, and they wanted to keep the others for the industrial. So again, that gets back to the lack of trust often, and the need for dialogue and creating collaborative approaches between stakeholders if we are going to move forward on those complex issues.
Thanks, Tara.
Thanks.
And I just wanted to add on to your comment very briefly to mention that USAID and the Department of Labor and the Department of State are all part of something called the Public-Private Alliance for Responsible Minerals Trade, which has members from big U.S. companies such as Apple and Google, as well as NGOs such as Global Witness. And the idea of this alliance is to think through supply chain solutions to address conflict minerals and to develop conflict-free supply chains. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because one of the issues that they're trying to tackle collectively is financial, the issue of financing, access to financing, etc. And so if you go to the Public-Private Alliance website, there's actually research on the role of financial institutions and barriers to that, and promoting responsible minerals trade from conflict-affected and high-risk areas.
Excellent. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Tara. Much appreciate your insights on that. Another quick question. I think we have time for just one or two more as we're getting very close to time here. This question is from Maxi Mwange. Hopefully I pronounced your name right, but Kimberly, please comment on the potential of ASM being a driver of cyclic poverty in ASM communities.
Sure. Thank you, Maxi, for that question. In terms of ASM being a driver of cyclic poverty, I think there are two ways to look at it. One of it is that it tends to be that people on the bottom of the supply chain for minerals are poor. That tends to be the case. It also tends to be the case that artisanal and small-scale mining is a really important source of livelihood for those people. Do know that finding livelihood alternatives tends to be quite difficult in the artisanal and small-scale mining space, because it often is one of the more lucrative activities in sort of remote areas where there's not a lot of other opportunities. So it's rather complex. So yes, a lot of people in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector are some of the poorer people. There is an issue sometimes of course, depending on where you are in the world, but issues of debt and essentially essentially debt bondage, or people who have a really difficult time getting out of the sector because there was pre-financing for their work, and that's a really major issue, and one that that we need to be paying attention to, and ones that don't have easy solutions. But I do think that the painstaking process of helping to formalize and regulate the sector, and really keeping miners at the center of our approach, and mining communities at the center of our approach, is the way to start to address that.
Excellent. Thank you, Kim. And so we are very close to time, or a little tiny bit over it, but I wanted to not skimp on this one last question, which has come from a number of folks who have asked questions. But the comment was that the presentations have been focused on legalization, economic development, but have not focused so much on the environmental and human health impacts. So I guess this is to all of the panelists, but to what extent is USAID focused on the environmental impacts and the human health impacts, and can you speak to that just a little bit? And Peter, maybe we could start with you on that question, with Oro Legal specifically.
Yeah, thanks, Kirby. No, just very briefly, too many good questions, I guess, to respond to. In terms of the broader environmental one, and then the public health concern, from our perspective, clearly we're not a public health program, although we work with public health organizations in the country, particularly around mercury, and I guess that'll probably transition into safe cyanide use as well over the coming years as trends come and go. There's 2 points that I'd like to make actually just about that. So I think there's nobody in this webinar at all that wouldn't say if we're going to develop ASGM, it should be well done at ASGM that includes coherent environmental management generally. The challenge that we've seen in Colombia is that the quest for very, very high levels of environmental performance within the most vulnerable part of the ASGM chain, ironically results in a perverse set of incentives, such that the task is so costly and so daunting that a lot of small miners choose not to do it at all. Just to give you an example, in order for us to comply with environmental licensing regulations here in Colombia, we've had to hire a team of 17 different consultants to respond to the specific terms of reference. And a couple of weeks ago, I asked one of the miners in one of the areas where we worked, did he know what an archaeologist was? And you've got to admire the influence of global TV, because he said, well, I was actually watching a program on Discovery TV the other day, and isn't it one of these guys that looks at old things? And I said, yeah, terrific, it's great that you know. Would you know where to find one? And he kind of looked at me like I was an idiot and kind of went, what, in this part of the world? No, not really, no, why'd you ask? And obviously I asked because there's a requirement for an archaeological study in the environmental regulations for mining formalization. So the possibility of complying that without support is pretty difficult. And the final bit, which is interesting, and I just want to touch on, because I know Jane Dennison's listening to this as well, and she's been involved in this quite critically. There's an interesting issue surrounding the evident significant reduction of mercury in a lot of mines that we work with, and that a number of programs are associated with. In our particular case, over the last 5 years, we've probably seen mercury use in alluvial mines dropping from about 35 grams per gram of gold about 5 years ago to just under 1 at the moment. Curiously enough, the key reason that happened wasn't actually environmental or wasn't actually controlled from authorities. It was a an import control on mercury imports that was instituted by the Colombian Ministry of Commerce that has effectively reduced the supply, significantly increased the cost, and effectively for a small group of miners that were heavily using mercury has forced them to consider kind of other environmentally friendly initiatives. So I kind of mention that actually because I'm an economist, and that's an interesting illustration of how economic controls might be more effective than environmental or policing ones.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. Kim and Tara, do you have any comments on the question about environmental and human health issues?
I do. Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Tara. You go first. Okay. Okay, I'll start us off. So thank you for that question. Certainly the environmental impacts of artisanal and small-scale mining are significant, and we should be paying very close attention to them. It is certainly worth noting that it is not appropriate to do artisanal and small-scale mining anywhere. We should be, USAID as part of a broader approach should be ensuring that there is also proper regulation of the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, which would mean, for instance, not being in valuable protected areas, etc. So that is certainly part of the formalization process. USAID actually has quite a bit of resources on this topic. For more information, there is sector environmental guidance on mining that addresses, of course, all the environmental aspects. There is also a really great report out on the biodiversity impacts of artisanal and small-scale mining in Latin America that is relevant globally, and we can provide links to those later. In terms of finding programs that I think have done a really good job of addressing the environmental impacts, I would look towards Peru and Colombia in particular. In Peru, there is a new program that I can't speak to the details of, but certainly it's a comprehensive approach to addressing some of these critical environmental issues, including strengthening justice institutions, et cetera, to make sure that environmental crimes are prosecuted, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not the best person to speak to that, but certainly just to note that we do have comprehensive programming on the environment, and there are resources available.
Yeah, I think I would just add quickly in a lot of our work where we try to approach environment looking before mining, during mining, and after mining, and taking kind of a holistic approach. Before mining is looking particularly at land use planning and collective community rights, and how we've had communities in Côte d'Ivoire effectively decide, well, this low-lying swamp we're reserving for rice and we're not going to mine it. This one will mine and rehabilitate, will allow. So tackling certain environmental things before mining even occurs. It's not always possible, but it can be if there are effective local management frameworks. During mining, having access to appropriate technology, training is particularly important. We've done a lot of work with what's called smarter mining techniques, so using benching and terracing to backfill as you extract the gravel and move along. It's not appropriate for all deposits, but we find that has been particularly good. Using hand augers, as I mentioned, was also something that's key, helps decide where mining should occur so there aren't test pits all over the place. And that's particularly attractive to miners because it increases productivity as well. And then post-mining, in terms of reclamation and regeneration, we've done a lot of work looking at natural regeneration of waterways and low-lying areas, and have found that there really is a interesting ecological processes that occur. It's not just an all bleak image of permanent devastation, especially where there is annual flooding that occurs, and these ecosystems do come back. They're transformed, they're put to new uses, and we've done a lot of research on that in the West African context. And then, of course, reclamation, when it is linked to livelihoods and land tenure clarification and agricultural support, is quite effective. In other words, you work with miners, figuring out, making sure that communities recognize the land rights over certain areas, and that opens up the way for especially vulnerable populations, women, certain outsiders in communities, to come in, invest their own resources to backfill and to start doing agricultural work in those areas, knowing that it won't necessarily be dug up immediately afterwards. So a broad topic that requires multiple seminars, but that's kind of one way in which we try to deal with the environmental questions holistically throughout the mining cycle and afterwards.
Excellent. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Peter, and thank you to all the participants. I think, Tara, you just highlighted a challenge that we've had is that this is a big, broad issue, and we haven't had enough time to really dive into the depth, and I can see that people are hungry for that. But thank you all for attending, and just wanted to let you know that there's a lot of information that's going to be coming out about this issue from USAID in the future, including a gender and ASM issue brief coming out in the near future. There is also a link on the screen that you can see there to the issue page for ASM on land links. There's also an email address that's a really valuable email address to save, landmatters@usaid.gov, if you are a USAID staff person, an implementing partner, or in the interagency. So if you work for another agency, please reach out to that email. And they can help with programming questions and technical questions like that.